Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you now? Okay, great. Good afternoon, and welcome to Boğaziçi University at this lovely Sunday afternoon. We're very glad to host this event together with our good friends from Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts as part of the 13th Istanbul Biennial, actually, and also the Columbia Global Center's Turkey, Istanbul. I'd like to thank a couple of people before I leave the floor to İpek to give introductions to Judith. And I have to also tell you that Judith will be taking questions after the talk. I'd like to particularly thank Bige Öner, the director of Istanbul Biennial, and Fulya Erdemci, the curator, for bringing us this nice event, along with, of course, our good friends from Columbia Global Center. Judith probably needs no introduction to most of you here, but we will actually do, or İpek will do that introduction so that if anyone is not aware of what she does, what she works on is what we held dearly in this particular university we are celebrating our 150th year. So whatever she's really working on has been high on our both academic agenda and social agenda at this campus. So I'll leave the floor to İpek to give introductions, and then we'll see. Thank you.
I know everyone is really eager to hear from Judith, so I'll be very short. On behalf of Columbia University and Columbia Global Centers Turkey, we're so happy and thrilled to have Judith Butler here with us. She's a world-renowned scholar, thinker, and activist whose work has provoked and transformed the fields of gender, sexual politics, and political philosophy. Judith Butler really needs no introduction, but to mention her most important works: Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, Undoing Gender, Bodies That Matter, On the Discursive Limits of Sex, Precarious Life, Powers of Violence and Mourning, Who Sings the Nation State, Language, Politics, Belonging, Frames of War, When is Life Grievable, Is Critique Secular, and most recently, Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism. She's also a well-known activist, recognized for her outspoken and principled positions on gender and sexual politics and human rights, as well as anti-war politics. Judith is based at the University of California, Berkeley, where she's the co-director of the program of critical theory, and we're fortunate to currently have her at Columbia University as the Wun Sun Tam Melon Visiting Professor of the Humanities. Here in Istanbul for this week, Judith will be leading a workshop at the Columbia Global Centers called Women Creating Change on Rethinking Vulnerability and Resistance, Feminism and Social Change. We're delighted to have the opportunity to engage and interact with Judith and all the scholars who will be at the workshop. Freedom of assembly, or who are the people? Judith, you couldn't have chosen a more timely topic given the turmoil and the social mobilizations occurring all around us, here in Turkey and elsewhere. Your remarks will no doubt offer us new and provocative ways about thinking on these poignant subjects. Please join me in welcoming Judith Butler to Istanbul once again.
Thank you so much. I'm extremely pleased to be here, and I want to thank certainly my hosts here at Boğaziçi University, the Columbia Global Centers, and the Istanbul Biennale. I'm most pleased to be here. I'm especially pleased once again to be in conversation with Zeynep Gambeti, who will enter the stage a bit later in the afternoon, evening, wherever we are. I did want to talk to you about this topic, but I'm aware that some people probably come here and they tell you who you are and what you're doing and what it means. And I'm not going to do that. I stand to learn from you, and one of the interesting dimensions of working theoretically is that sometimes the theory doesn't seem to be located in place and time, which means that when people take it up, they take it up and they give it a place and time, or they change the theory depending on how it's appropriated in a given place and time. Of course, theory is always generated from places and times, even if it doesn't acknowledge that. But I'm hoping that that it might be considered, at least for the purposes of our conversation here today, as a kind of meeting point, or a question of translation, a site of translation between spaces and times. And we'll see how well that works. And when it doesn't work, my guess is that that will be very important to learn. Okay. There are many examples of people coming together, forming a way of speaking as a collective, demanding a change in policy, exposing the absence of state legitimacy and/or the dissolution of a government. Tahrir Square became emblematic of this assembly of bodies on the street in recent years. They are the ones who first demanded the dissolution, well, actually after Tunisia, the dissolution of the Mubarak regime, and then more recently, in different configurations, arrived on the street en masse to object to various policies of the transitional regime, to the appointment of officials known to have engaged in torture in the previous regime, to the terms of a new constitution, and to the dissolution of the court system by executive decree. Although Tahrir Square became emblematic for contemporary democracy struggles, although perhaps Gezi Park will now become the emblem, there is now every reason to conclude that the so-called second revolution, in Egypt at least, is a counter-revolution. So at the heart of this emblem of popular assembly is a conflict, a question, a growing set of doubts. Let us assume that no one assembly can rightly become the basis for generalizations about all assemblies, and that the efforts to associate a particular uprising or mobilization with democracy itself is a temptation as thrilling as it is erroneous. Can we even know who the we is who assembles in the street and asserts itself by speech or silence, by action or steady inaction, by gesture, or simply by gathering together as a group of bodies in public space, visible, audible, tangible, exposed, existing, persistent, interdependent? Let us assume from the start that it is not by way of a particular and punctual speech act that a group comes together as a people. Although we often think that the declarative speech act by which we the people consolidates its popular sovereignty is one that issues from such an assembly, it is perhaps more appropriate to say that the assembly is already speaking before it utters any words. That by coming together, it is already an enactment of popular will, and that this is something other than being a single and unified subject who must declare its will through a vocalization. The we voiced in language is already enacted by the assembly of bodies, their gestures and movements, their vocalizations, their ways of acting in concert, to cite Hannah Arendt. To act in concert does not mean to act in conformity. It may be that people are moving or speaking in several directions at once, or even at cross purposes. And it does not mean that the people speak the exact same words, although sometimes that happens in a chant or in a verbal relay. Sometimes the people act by way of their collective silence or their ironic use of language, their humor, and even their mockery, taking up and taking over a language they seek to derail from its usual ends. And perhaps Zeynep will talk to us a little bit about that later. So already there are 2 points I want to underscore. The first is that the actions by which people assemble and assert themselves to be a people may be spoken or enacted in another way. The second is simply that we have to be able to think of such acts as plural action, presupposing a plurality of bodies who enact their convergent purposes in ways that do not require strict conformity to a single kind of acting or to a single kind of claim. At issue for us will be the question of how politics changes when the idea of abstract rights, vocally claimed by individuals, gives way to a plurality of embodied actors who enact their claims, sometimes through language, sometimes not. Let us consider then how we might, in light of this shift in framework, understand freedom of assembly. In what sense is it a right, and how is it claimed? As a right, what does it presuppose about who we are and who we might be? The right to exercise the freedom of assembly, sometimes understood as the freedom of association, is by now well documented in international law. The International Labor Organization makes explicit that rights to assembly, or associational rights, are tied to the rights of collective bargaining. This means that people assemble in order to negotiate the conditions of work, including demands for safety, job security, protections against exploitation, but also the right to collective bargaining itself. The right assembles workers together. No one has a right of assembly without a group of others who are in a structurally similar position in relation to the workforce. In some human rights discourses, the freedom of assembly is described as a fundamental form of freedom that deserves to be protected by government, which means that governments are obligated to protect that freedom. Paradoxically, perhaps, governments must protect the freedom of assembly against governmental interference, which is a way of saying that governments are under strict obligations to restrain themselves from attacking the rights of assembly by the illegitimate use of police and judicial powers to detain or arrest, harass, threaten, censor, imprison, injure, or kill. As we can see, there is a risk in this formulation from the start. Does freedom of assembly depend upon being protected by government? Or does it depend on a protection from government? Does it make sense for the people, holding at bay who they are, to rely on government to protect itself from government? Does the right exist only if a government confers this right on its people, and to the degree that a government agrees to protect that right? If so, then the destruction of those rights of assembly by a government cannot be opposed by asserting the rights of assembly. We can agree that freedom of assembly cannot be founded in natural law, but is it still in some important way independent of any and every government? Does freedom of expression, in fact, exceed, even defy, those acts of government by which it is protected and defied? These rights do not and cannot depend on governmental protection in those cases when the legitimacy of a government and the power of the state is being contested precisely by such an assembly, or when a specific state has contravened, violated, the rights of assembly such that its population can no longer freely congregate without threat of state interference, including military and police intervention. Moreover, when the power of the state to protect rights becomes identified with the power of the state to withdraw that protection, then freedom of assembly is exercised precisely to contest that form of arbitrary and illegitimate power. Some would say freedom of assembly in those cases contests the sovereignty of the state, and that sovereignty implies this capacity to withdraw protection of the rights of populations. I think the Agambenian idea of state sovereignty involves basically the state's exercise of the prerogative to suspend or withdraw rights. That may be true, and his formulation has been productive and useful, to be sure, but perhaps what is being opposed in such mobilizations is the idea, the very idea, that freedom of assembly itself can be lost as a right when the state opposes the aims of a particular assembly. That happens, as we know, when the state itself becomes engaged in facilitating the expansion of markets, in turning its own public obligations and services over to financial institutions, transforming public entitlements into either consumer goods or investment opportunities. The anti-privatization movement seeks to stop the saturation of the state by market forces. Such movements often happen in tandem with calling into question the legitimacy of a government that has assumed authoritarian powers. No one is anymore arguing that free markets now foster democracy, as Milton Friedman notoriously did in Chile, where the expansion of markets and authoritarianism worked beautifully together. In both cases, or in those cases in which both privatization and authoritarianism are being publicly opposed, and I take that to be the case here, the state uses its own military, police, and legal powers to suppress the freedom of assembly and other related freedoms precisely to censor those viewpoints and threaten and confine those who hold them. So the freedom of assembly, in my view, has to be something other than a specific right allocated and protected by existing nation states. That would mean that freedom of assembly requires that the state confers and protects that right, and that the state remain in place, and that without the state there is no right. Under those conditions, we could not rightly or legitimately assemble to call for the end of a government, or even to contest the legitimacy of its power or particular uses of power over our freedom to assemble. So in this way, I want to conjecture that the freedom of assembly has to precede and exceed any form of government that confers and protects that right of assembly. I say this not to affirm forms of permanent anarchy, and certainly not to condone forms of mob rule. Rather, I want to suggest that freedom of assembly may well be a precondition of politics itself, one that presumes that bodies can move and gather in unregulated ways, and that they can enact their political demands in a space that becomes public or redefines the public by virtue of those very enactments. That assembly may be called the people, or it may be one version of the people, but they do not speak in one voice or even in one language. They are beings with the capacity to move with whatever technical and infrastructural supports they require to do so, and that means they can resolve to stand still, not to move, even to become immovable in their desires and their demands. The power to move or to be still, to speak and to act, belongs to the assembly prior to and in excess of whatever rights a particular government decides to confer or to protect. That very power of government may well become what freedom of assembly opposes, and at that moment we see the operation of a form of popular sovereignty that is distinct from state sovereignty, and whose task it is, as popular sovereignty, to distinguish itself from state sovereignty. How then do we think about freedom of assembly as I'm trying to articulate it here, and the idea of popular sovereignty? I know that some people consider sovereignty a kind of bad word. one that associates politics with a singular subject and a form of executive power with territorial claims. But consider that sovereignty is but one way of describing acts of political self-determination, especially for indigenous peoples, which is why popular movements of indigenous struggle for sovereignty have become important ways to lay claim to space, to move freely, to express one's views, to seek reparation and justice. Although elections are the way that government officials are supposed to represent popular sovereignty, or the popular will, more specifically, the meaning of popular sovereignty has never been fully exhausted by the act of voting. Of course, voting is essential for any concept of popular sovereignty, but the exercise of sovereignty neither begins nor ends with the act of voting. Elections have never fully transferred sovereignty from the populace to its elected representatives. Something of popular sovereignty always remains untransferable, marking the outside of the electoral process. If not, there would be no popular means of objecting to corrupt electoral processes. In a sense, the power of the populace remains separate from the power of those elected, even after they have elected them, for only as separate can the power of the populace continue to contest the conditions and results of elections, as well as the actions of elected officials. If the sovereignty of the people is fully transferred to and replaced by those whom the majority elect, then what is lost are those powers we call critical, those actions we call resistance, and the lived possibility we call revolution. So popular sovereignty certainly translates into electoral power when the people vote, but that voting is never a full or adequate translation of popular sovereignty into state sovereignty. Something of popular sovereignty remains untranslatable, non-transferable, and even unsubstitutable, which is why it can both elect and dissolve regimes. As much as popular sovereignty legitimates parliamentary forms of power, it also retains the power to withdraw its support from those same forms when they prove to be illegitimate. If parliamentary forms of power require popular sovereignty for their legitimacy, they also surely fear it, for there is something about popular sovereignty that runs counter to and exceeds or even outruns every parliamentary form that it institutes and grounds. An elected regime can be brought to a halt or overcome by that assembly of people who speak in the name of the people, enacting the very we who holds final legitimating power under conditions of democratic rule. In other words, the conditions of democratic rule depend finally on an exercise of popular sovereignty that is never fully contained or expressed by any particular democratic order, but which is the condition of its democratic character. This is, I would suggest, an extra parliamentary power without which no parliament can function legitimately, and which threatens every parliament with dysfunction or even dissolution. We may want to call it an anarchist interval or a permanent principle of revolution that resides within democratic orders, one that shows up more or less at moments of founding and at moments of dissolution. All this may seem clear enough, but a difficult and persistent question remains. Who are the people? Have we yet posed that question? And here I know that I come late to this debate. Derrida, Laclos, Balibar, so many people, Spivak have all offered theoretical formulations for understanding what I am trying to ask here. And they remain with me in tacit conversation as I think, but so too do the pressing demands of contemporary mobilizations. We cannot simply point to the people or take a snapshot that confirms who they are. We cannot simply rely on aerial photographs taken by police charged with managing crowds on the street, for that would really make the people into a matter of demographic forensics. That photograph would doubtless have a frame. That frame would both include and exclude what it captures. The same would be true of a video that starts and ends somewhere and is always limited by the perspective by which its object is selectively crafted. One thing we know is that not all the people assemble in the street, or at least not on the same street. Zooming in, zooming out will not help us here, since those are precisely ways of editing and selecting what and who will count, which means we cannot separate the question of who the people are from the technology that establishes and disestablishes which people will count as the people. Perhaps the people exceed every visual frame that seeks to capture the people. Sometimes the people, or some people, are confined or absent or outside the purview of the street and the camera. The prison is a case in point. It never really happens that all of the possible people who are represented by the notion of the people show up in the same space and at the same time to claim that they are the people, as if they were all free to move, as if they all, of their own volition, arrived together in some space and time that can be described or photographed in some inclusive way. Indeed, it would actually be odd, if not terrifying, to imagine every member of the group called the people coming together and speaking in unison. It would have to be an image or fantasy. Usually we associate such forms of unanimous speaking, in which everyone is saying the exact same thing at the same time, with forms of fascism or compulsory forms of conformity. In fact, we the people, the utterance, the chant, the written line, is always missing some group of people it claims to represent. Some people fail to show up or are constrained from doing so. Some live on the margins of the metropole, yet others seem to be saying something else, or they're texting or blogging or functioning through new media. Some are emphatically or indifferently not speaking at all. This means that the people never really arrive as a collective presence that speaks in verbal unity. Whoever the people may be, they are surely internally divided, appearing differentially or sequentially, or never appearing at all, or sometimes in degree, probably also in some measure both gathered and dispersed, and so ultimately not a unity. So what follows? A people do not need to be united on every issue or all gathered in a single space for concerted action to take place in the name of the people. That name, the people, even the declaration, we the people, does not quite capture what the people do, for there's always something other than the particular group that has formed and appeared and seems to be speaking of what the people might want. Precisely because there's a gap between what happens in the name of the people and what the people want, we have to rethink who the people are. Not all the people want the same thing or want it in the same way. This failure does not need to be lamented. The name of the people is appropriated, contested, and renewed, always at risk of being expropriated or dismissed, and the fragility and ferocity that marks the hegemonic struggle over the name, the people, is, I think, signs of its democratic operation. So even as some speaker or set of speakers invokes a we who fairly and fully represents all the people, the plural we cannot really do what it nevertheless does. Such speakers may surely continue to strive for more inclusive aims, underscoring the aspirational character of the we. Right? So I say we, I don't describe who the we is, but I posit a we I hope will materialize. But if the we is to work politically, it has to be restricted to those who attempt to achieve and exercise hegemonic power over its invocation. Indeed, those who assemble as the we, presenting themselves as the people, are not finally representing the people fully and adequately, although they are performing several functions at once. As voters or potential voters, they provide the legitimating ground for those who do come to represent the people through elections. But equally importantly, the claim of elected officials to be representative requires the condensation of the people into a set of votes that can be tallied as a majority. In this sense, the people are always abbreviated, if not nearly lost, at the moment in which they elect those who represent them. And political representation is, in a sense, what abbreviates and quantifies something we might call the will of the people. At the same time, something non-electoral is at work, and I tried to explain that this anarchist interval is there, I think, in all democratic political mobilization. The people who speak the we, whether within the electoral process, outside it, or against it, constitute themselves as the people in the course of enacting or vocalizing that plural pronoun, either literally or figuratively. Standing silent together in the face of the police can be precisely an enactment of that plural pronoun. These acts of self-making or self-constitution are not quite the same as representing oneself or being represented. We can see why when we track how the discursive term works. The term the people does not only represent a pre-existing collection. If it did, the term would postdate the production of the collectivity itself. The term can never adequately represent a collectivity when, as it should be, the collectivity is in the process of being made or of making itself. This inadequacy is part of its meaning and part of its promise. The discursive invocation of the we refers then to a people whose needs, desires, demands are not yet fully known, and whose coming together is bound up with a future that is not yet lived out. Indeed, practices of self-determination are not quite the same as acts of self-representation, and yet both of these are at work in exercising the freedom of assembly, in which we, the people, is spoken or enacted in some way. This enactment is, in my view, performative inasmuch as it brings the people into being whom it names, or it calls upon them to gather under the utterance. And this means that it's part of a process of self-determination, a designation of who we are that is also at the same time the making of that we. The invocation of we separates popular sovereignty from state sovereignty. In fact, I want to say it names and inaugurates that very separation time and again. The plurality always breaks with those who are elected, or whose election becomes questionable to us, or in relation to a state whose representatives we have never had the choice to elect, as is the clear case under occupation for the undocumented and the non-citizen. So something that must fail as representation, something we might call non-representative and nearly tautological, becomes the basis of democratic forms of political self-determination. Popular sovereignty, distinct from state sovereignty, or rather popular sovereignty, precisely as it time and again distinguishes itself from state sovereignty. Popular sovereignty makes sense only in this perpetual act of separating from state sovereignty. Thus, it is a way of forming a people through acts of self-naming, self-designation, self-gathering. These are repeated enactments, verbal and non-verbal, bodily and virtual, undertaken across spatial and temporal zones and on different kinds of public stages, virtual realities, and shadow regions. The vocalized performative we the people is surely one kind of enactment. It's part of this enactment we are calling self-determination or self-constitution. But this vocal figure cannot be taken as a literal account of how political self-determination works. Not every act of political self-determination can be translated into that verbal utterance. Such a move would make the verbal domain more privileged than any other. In fact, the enactment of political self-determination is necessarily a crossing of the linguistic and the bodily, even if the action that constitutes self-enactment, self-designation, is remaining silent or being immovable, even when the body is sequestered. How do we, for instance, understand the hunger strike, if not precisely as the practiced refusal of a body that cannot appear in public? This means that appearing in public in a bodily form is not an adequate way of thinking about political self-determination if we want to include the hunger strike or prisoner resistance movements as part of self-determination. Prisoner networks are precisely those forms of solidarity that cannot appear in public in a bodily form. They rely predominantly on digital media reports without images. Those networks of prisoners, activists, lawyers, and extended kin and social relations, whether here in Turkey, where you have a vast number of people imprisoned for political reasons, in Palestine or at Pelican Bay in California, those networks are also, I want to argue, forms of assembly composed of people who are exercising their freedom through strikes and petitions and forms of legal and political representation and acts of civil disobedience. Even as they do not appear, they are exercising a certain right to appear in public, either before the law or in public space or in the media, objecting precisely to the interdiction against appearing publicly that is the condition of imprisonment. Given all this, let us recapitulate what it might mean for rethinking freedom of assembly in relation to popular sovereignty. First of all, popular sovereignty is a form of reflexive self-making that is separate from the very representative regime it legitimates. Secondly, it arises in the course of separating from state sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, third, cannot legitimate any particular regime without being separate from it. That is, without being controlled. That is, it must not be controlled by a regime or fully operationalized as its instrument. And yet, popular sovereignty is the basis upon which legitimate government is formed through fair and inclusive elections. Its act of self-making, fourth, I guess, is actually a series of spatially distributed acts, ones that do not always operate in the same way and for the same purposes. Among the most important of these spatial distinctions is that between the public sphere and spheres of forcible confinement, including the prison where political prisoners, those who have exercised freedom of assembly and freedom of speech, are contained and subjugated. This passage into and out of the public sphere is regulated precisely by legal and police power and the institution of the prison. Finally, then, fifth, the enactment of "we the people" may or may not take linguistic form. Both speech and silence, movement and immobility are all political enactments. The hunger strike is precisely the inverse of the fed body standing freely in the public domain and speaking. It marks and resists the deprivation of that right. It enacts and exposes the deprivation that prison populations suffer. So, in a broad theoretical way, I suppose I'm suggesting that there are enactments that are not fully reducible to assertions. Assertions, I want to say, even vocalizations, are but one form of political enactment, which is why the sphere of political performativity includes and exceeds verbal and written utterances. Since the public sphere is constituted in part through sites of forcible sequestering, the borders that define the public are also those which define the confined, the sequestered, and the imprisoned. Whether we're speaking about the borders of the nation state, where refugees and the undocumented are confined within encampments, where rights of citizenship are denied or indefinitely suspended, or prisons where indefinite detention has become the norm, The interdiction against appearing and moving and speaking in public becomes the precondition of embodied life and indeed embodied forms of resistance. The prison is not exactly the inverse of the public sphere, since prison advocacy networks traverse the walls of the prison, but the prison is, I want to suggest, the limit case of the public sphere, marking the power of the state to control who can pass into the public and who must pass out of it. As long as the state controls the very conditions of freedom of assembly, then popular sovereignty becomes an instrument of state sovereignty, and the legitimating conditions of the state are lost at the same time that freedom of assembly is robbed of both its critical and democratic function. Maybe all this is already known. Maybe there's nothing new here. But sometimes, as an academic, you're always under pressure to say something new. But in the political sphere, sometimes you have to say the exact same thing 1,000 times before it is heard. So I don't care if it's radically new, but I do care that someone hears me at some point. Do I make a fetish out of the notion of the people? Well, the invocation of the people becomes and must become contestable at the very moment that it appears. We started here today with the claim that the actions by which people assemble and assert themselves to be a people may be spoken or enacted in ways that include inaction and stillness. The second is that we have to be able to think of such acts as plural action, presupposing a plurality of bodies who enact their convergent purpose in ways that do not require strict conformity to a single kind of acting or to a single kind of claim, and who do not together constitute a single kind of subject. I have now begun, I think, to add a third claim, which is that the prison is the limit case of the public sphere, as is, by the way, the refugee camp, and that freedom of assembly is haunted by the possibility of imprisonment. One may be imprisoned for what one says, or one may be imprisoned by assembling, for assembling. Or one may be imprisoned for writing or teaching about assemblies, or about freedom struggles, or by teaching about popular struggles for sovereignty, such as the Kurdish movement. All of these are reasons why those with the freedom to appear can never fully or adequately represent the people, since there are people who we know are missing from the public, missing from this public, and they are those who must find representation, even as those who seek to represent them risk sometimes imprisonment for doing so. And it's not just that there are some people who happen to be missing here today who could not have gathered in Gezi or who can no longer gather there. That very power of confinement is a way of defining, producing, and controlling what will count as the public sphere. It works alongside privatization as a process that seeks to make public space into the entrepreneurial field of the market-driven state. So though we may wonder why it is that crowds that gather to oppose privatization are broken up and dispersed by police force, gassing and physical assault, we have to remember that the state, which is offloading public space to private enterprise, or that now makes such decisions according to market values, is involved in at least two ways of controlling and decimating public space. Some lament that a movement that begins with opposing privatization inevitably becomes a movement that opposes police violence. I certainly heard this time and again in the United States in relation to the Occupy movement. We started with this great critique, and it always becomes about the police. But what I want to suggest here is that the seizure of public space from popular sovereignty, from freedom of assembly in particular, is precisely the aim of both privatization and police assaults on freedom of assembly. In this way as well, the market and the prison work together in a prison industry which, as Angela Davis has clearly shown, works to regulate rights of citizenship. In the US, this happens in irrefutably racist ways, as black men constitute the vast majority of prisoners. We can add that the market and the prison also work together to constrict and decimate and appropriate public space where we might expect to find what Hannah Arendt has called the right to appear. If the plural subject is constituted in the course of its performative enactments, then that means it's not already constituted. It means as well that whatever form it has prior to its performative exercise is not quite the same as the form it takes on as it acts and after it has acted. The we affects a certain gathering. At the same time, it's only when bodies gather in some particular configuration of space and time that any we comes into being, even if it is not explicitly spoken. So how do we then understand this movement of gathering, which is durational and implies occasional, periodic, or definitive forms of scattering? It's not one act, but rather a convergence of enactments different from one another, a form of political sociality irreducible to conformity. Even when a crowd speaks together, they have to gather in close enough proximity to hear someone else's voice, to pace one's own vocalization, achieve rhythm, harmony to a sufficient degree, and so to achieve a relation both auditory and corporeal with those with whom some signifying action or speech act is undertaken. We start to speak now, and we stop now. We start to move now, or more or less at a given time, but certainly not as a single organism. We try to stop all at once, but some keep moving, and others move and rest at their own pace. Temporal seriality and coordination, bodily proximity, auditory range, coordinated vocalization. All of these constitute essential dimensions of assembly and demonstration. And they are all presupposed by the speech act that enunciates we the people. They're the complex elements of the occasion of its enunciation. Is there then any speech act that brings forth we the people that's not a bodily and political movement of some kind? Does that speech act always presuppose, gather, and enact a body politic? On the one hand, if we take vocalization as the model of the speech act, then the body is surely presupposed as the organ of speech, both the organic condition and vehicle of speech. The body is not transmuted into pure thought when it speaks, but continues to signify the organic conditions for verbalization. So if speech is conceptualized restrictively as vocalized speech act, there is no speech without the organ of speech, which means that there's surely no speech act without the organic, or at least without the technical. But what does the organic dimension of speech do to the claims made in speech or on behalf of speech? I want to suggest that if one assumes that speech reflects consciousness and the intention of the speaker or the will of an assembly, then intention or will are figured as cognitive moments represented by speech. Speech is then understood as corresponding to these prior cognitive dispositions. Shoshana Feldman has made this clear in her Le Scandale du Corps Parlant, I don't know what it's called in English right now, that precisely because speech is impossible without the organic, even the speech act that seeks to convey a purely cognitive intention cannot circumvent the organic body. The most purely ideal intention manifest in speech is impossible without its bodily enactment. So just as there is no purely linguistic speech act separated from bodily acts, there's no purely conceptual moment of thought that can do away with its own embodied condition. And this tells us something about what it means to say we the people, since whether it's written in a text or uttered on the street, it designates an assembly in the act of designating and forming itself. It acts on itself as it acts, and a corporeal condition of plurality is indexed whether or not it appears on the occasion of the utterance. That bodily condition, plural and dynamic, is a constitutive dimension of the occasion. All right, I have much more to say about all that, but you know I'm going to move ahead. So one of the things I want to say on the basis of this particular reflection is that the embodied character of the people proves quite important to the kinds of demands that are made. When, for instance, wealth is accumulated among 2% of the population, and increasing numbers of people lose their homes and employment, then the people are clearly divided along class lines and economic power is distributed in radically unequal ways. When those who face accelerating prospects of precarity take to the streets and begin their claim with "we the people," or by simply gathering, then they are asserting that they, those who appear and speak, are identified as the people. They are working to combat oblivion. The phrase does not imply that those who profit are not the people, and it doesn't even necessarily imply a simple sense of inclusion, we are the people too. Rather, it asserts a form of equality in the face of increasing inequality. And it does this not simply by uttering the phrase, but by embodying equality to whatever extent that proves possible, constituting an assembly of the people on the grounds of equality. One might say they are asserting inequality in the midst of, they are asserting equality in the midst of inequality, and that this is vain and useless since their act is only symbolic and it's a small group, and true economic equality continues to be more elusive for those whose debts are astronomical and unpayable and employment prospects foreclosed. And yet I still want to argue, and I'm happy to be accused of being naive, that the embodiment of equality in the practices of assembly, the insistence on interdependency, the commonly held ground, all start to put into the world a version of equality that is rapidly vanishing in other quarters. The point is not to regard the body merely as an instrument for making a political claim that has cognitive and/or linguistic features, but to let this body, this plurality of bodies, become the precondition of all further political claims. Indeed, in the politics of the street that has been with us in the last years, in the Occupy movement, Tahrir Square, Porta del Sol, Gezi Park, the basic requirements of the body are at the center of political mobilizations. Those requirements are in fact publicly enacted prior to any set of political demands. Over and against forces of privatization, the destruction of public services and space, and the ideals of the public good precipitated by the takeover of neoliberal forms of rationality in governance and everyday life, bodies gather who require food, shelter, protection from injury and violence, the freedom to move, to work, to have access to health care. Bodies require other bodies for support and for survival. It matters what age those bodies are, whether they are able-bodied, since in all forms of dependency, bodies require not just one other person, but social systems of support that are complexly human and technical. Such systems of support are precisely what are being decimated by privatization, neoliberalism, and austerity measures, but also by systemically induced global inequalities. It is precisely in a world in which the bodily life of increasing numbers of people is proving to be highly precarious that bodies emerge together on the pavement or the dirt or along the wall that separates them from their land. They form assemblies which can include virtual participants, and even then they assume a set of interlocking locations for a plural set of bodies. In this way, the bodies belong to the pavement, the ground, the architecture, and the technology by which they live and move and work and desire. We cannot really speak about bodies without their environments, the machines, the complex systems of social interdependency, which are their conditions of support. No body survives, much less flourishes, without such conditions of support. Although there are those who say that active bodies assembled on the street constitute a powerful and surging multitude, one that in itself constitutes a radical democratic event or action, I find that I can only partially agree with that view. When the people break off from established power, they do enact the popular will, or seek to, though to know that for certain, we would have to know who is breaking off, and where, and when, and who does not break off, and where are they. There are, after all sorts of surging multitudes I would not want to endorse, even if I do not dispute their right to assemble. They would include lynch mobs, anti-Semitic or racist or fascist congregations, and violent forms of anti-parliamentary mass movements. I'm less concerned with the ostensible vitality of surging multitudes or any nascent and promising life force that seems to belong to their collective action than joining in a struggle to establish more sustaining conditions of livability in the face of systematically induced precarity and forms of racial destitution. The final aim of politics is, in my view, not simply to surge forth together, although I suppose that would be one way to go out, though this can be an essential moment of effective intensity within a broader struggle against precarity. I do not doubt it. It can constitute a new lived sense of the people, even if sometimes for the purposes of radical democratic change, which I do endorse, it is important to surge forth in ways that claim and alter the attention of the world for some more enduring possibility of livable life for all. It is one thing to feel alive or to affirm aliveness, and yet another to say that that fleeting sense is all that we can expect from politics. Feeling alive is not quite the same as struggling for a world in which life becomes livable for those who have not yet been valued as living beings. Okay, a little polemic. Although I understand that something has to hold such a group together, some demand, some felt sense of injustice and unlivability, some shared intimation of the possibility of change, and that change has to be fueled by a resistance to minimally existing and expanding economic inequalities, ever accelerating conditions of precarity for many populations, both locally and globally, forms of authoritarian and securitarian control that seek to suppress democratic processes and mass movements and state and institutional racism. On the one hand, there are bodies that assemble on the street or online or through other less visible networks of solidarity, especially prison networks, whose political claims are made through forms of solidarity that may or may not directly appear in public space. On the other hand, there are mobilizations that emerge in public that make their claims through action, gesture, language, movement, through linking arms, through refusing to move, to forming bodily modes of obstruction to police and state authorities. A given movement can move in and out of the space of heightened public exposure, depending on its strategies and the military and police threats it must face. Militant and plural exposure is the site where need and resistance converge. To return to the beginning then, how are we to understand what makes assemblies possible and what makes them effective? It is not, I would suggest, exclusively or primarily as subjects bearing abstract rights that we take to the streets. If we bear those rights to freedom of assembly, to constitute ourselves as a people, then we enact them in our bodily practices. They may well be stated, but the statement is already in the assembly, signified by plural bodies coming together before anyone has to speak, or by bodies undergoing resistance in different cells and across continents at the same time, the transcontinental hunger strike. We take to the streets if we have the power to do so because we need to walk or move there. We need streets to be structured so that whether or not we require technical assistance, we can move there, pass through that space without obstruction, harassment, administrative detention, fear of injury or death. If we are on the streets, it's because the streets define us politically as beings who must lay claim to public freedom. But it is also because we are bodies who require government commitment to public space, infrastructural support, social service for our continuing existence. Mobility is itself a right of the body, to be sure. It is also a precondition for the exercise of other rights, including the right of assembly. Assembly is at once the condition of any possible claim, at the same time that it is a specific right to which an assembly lays claim, which is why an assembly articulates some fundamental dimension of democratic life prior to, apart from, making any verbal claim. Finally, let us remember that every claim we make to the public sphere is haunted by the prison and anticipates the prison. In other words, here in Gezi and on in other parks or other streets, you have been detained and arrested, or you are close to people who have been detained and arrested. That is now the risk of appearing in public. And those medical professionals who came to help you have been arrested for trying to help you, and those lawyers who sought to defend your rights of assembly and expression have been detained and arrested for doing so. And those human rights workers who sought to bring these crimes to the broader international public have also been detained or threatened with arrest. And those people in the media who sought to make known what has happened here have also been censored, detained, and arrested. This means that wherever the people seek to make the public space their own, an emblem of popular sovereignty, you risk being stopped, injured, or imprisoned by the police who represent state power. This means that when we think about public assembly, we are always thinking about the police power that lets it happen, that stops it from happening, the moment in which the state starts to attack the people it is supposed to represent and whose rights it is entrusted to protect. This means that forms of solidarity with political prisoners, indeed with all people incarcerated under unjust conditions, means that solidarity has to happen across the public sphere and the sphere of confinement. Prisoners are precisely those who are denied freedom of assembly and access to public space. So the very government movement to privatize state parks and to allow privatization to take the place of public goods and public rights is at once a movement to establish police control over public space. There is no more effective way to do this than by imprisoning those who claim the right to public space. And they do this through expelling protesters who seek to claim the public sphere for the public, for the people. That is one way to understand the arrest and detention of those who have fought the state as it wages its war on public life. For us, I think this means that forms of solidarity can never be restricted to public assembly alone, since prisoner networks are forms of solidarity that are built in confinement. And it is their ability to move freely in public and to express and enact their political claims to the public for which we also have to struggle. So it seems we have to understand every public space is haunted by the police station and the police and the prison, and that to walk and move and speak there in concert is precisely to come up against the possibility of being forbidden access to that common world. If privatization seeks to destroy public space, so prison is the ultimate way of barring access to public space. In this sense, privatization and prison work together to keep you out of the places where you know that you belong to each other. No one can have the right to public assembly alone. As any of us claim that right, as we must, we have to do it with one another, in the midst of all our differences and disagreements, and in solidarity with those who have already lost that right, who have never been recognized as belonging to that public. This is especially true for those who appear on the street without permits, who are opposing the police or the military or other security forces without weapons, who are transgendered in transphobic environments, who are without documents in countries that seek to criminalize those who ask for rights of citizenship. Although one may be shorn of protection, one is not reduced to some sort of bare life. Let's not insult the subjugated with that particular term. On the contrary, to be shorn of protection is a form of political exposure, at once concretely vulnerable, even breakable, and potentially and actively defiant, even revolutionary. The bodies that assemble together designate and form themselves as we the people, targeting those forms of abstraction that would act as if those social and bodily requirements for life can be destroyed for the sake of neoliberal metrics and market rationalities. To show up in an assembly opposed to such destitution is to be exposed, is to be defiant, meaning precisely that we are crafted precisely in that disjuncture. In crafting ourselves, we expose, we do the bodies in the name of which we make our demand. We do this for and with one another without any necessary presumption of harmony or of love. We do not have to know each other to make this demand for one another. No body is possible without those other bodies, linked, we might say, by the arm, or linked, we might say, in the name of another concept of democracy that demands new forms of solidarity on and off the street. Thank you.
I want to thank Judith for this wonderfully inspiring and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you. I have so many points to make that I'd better not make them now, Judith.
No, you have to make a few. That's why you're here. That's why you're here.
No.
A few.
It just to tell you, it resonated so well, and I guess the audience will already say this to you. It did resonate so well with the experience of the Gezi Park here, which is, of course, part of this global popular sort of wave of popular uprisings that we call Occupy movements, but it really did touch a chord here. And just for the sake of giving the audience also some time to engage with you, I would like to just open the question.
Okay.
Would you mind?
I don't mind.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we could proceed like this. Since we have about 30 minutes, or 40 maximum, I guess, for the questions, could we take 3 questions at a time? Let Judith answer, then proceed and see where we go. And if we can keep the questions sort of short, we can allow everybody to speak.
I'm sure we can't allow everyone to speak.
I mean, no, you said, this is the popular assembly, here we're representative of something, maybe we could begin with that. So is there anybody who would like to start with a question? Just somebody over there? Here, okay.
We start here?
Yeah, there's a microphone that's coming. Maybe if you could just say your name also, that would be lovely. No, it's not working. See how dependent we are on technology.
My name is Catherine Allen, and I'm a graduate student from the University of Ottawa in Canada, and I'm a research assistant at So my question is about problem sovereignty in relation to commentators. A lot of what happened, not only in the Arab Spring, but here in Turkey, Occupy movement, a lot of people, what we did was more commenting through social media than it was necessarily participating. So either through Twitter, through Facebook, through any social media, but by commentating, people felt that they were part of it, of whatever it was that was taking place, and they were part of the popular sovereignty or the assembly. And maybe I feel like there's something disingenuous a little bit in that type of exercise, contemporary exercise of simply commenting and sort of accrediting that you are maybe part of it by that simple act or that speech act of whether it's a witty comment or, being the political social media person. So I guess my question would be, how can we sort of discuss this rule that people sort of take part of these assemblies without actually being part of them, by virtue of giving ourselves this right to comment and liberation overall.
We're going to take another. I'll get back to you. I guess I'm taking other questions.
If you like, if
that's fine.
Yeah, okay.
My name is Bella. I was wondering, when you're talking about solidarity, that it doesn't have to be in harmony. What's the claim? Is it just a common claim for the right to Istanbul? That people should all work for together, or how can you then say if everyone has different goals, how can people work there and going for the same thing, but then people start claiming different things and there's conflicts coming up. What is it that should be bringing us and holding us together?
There's one over there. There's one other over there.
Thank you very much, first of all, for your talk. There are lots of things that one could ask after this wonderful talk. One of the things that I had in my mind as you were speaking about these mobs or street demonstrations, what should we call them, movements already, the changes across space and time. I have Mars and Near East Empire in my mind, so I wanted to ask you if you see any changes in terms of the way those people come together and the way those people, start speaking together. Because I'm in the movement, we haven't seen this sort of, I thought the question of who are these people and no real value. This question perhaps, I don't know, is it an outcome question? Is it an outcome question to these new protests? This is one of the questions that I have.
Okay, can I just do that? Great.
Is it open?
I'm not sure. Oh, perhaps that works. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Those are all good questions. The first question, I feel maybe it comes out of some kind of guilt. I was going, don't be guilty. But seriously, let's think about it this way: that any popular assembly to be effective has to be established by one media or another. In other words, media is a precondition of the knowability, legibility of a particular movement, assembly, demonstration. So there's always that dependency on media, and it's constitutive. So to be part of the mediated elaboration of the event is actually already important to it. And whether you're reporting it or commenting on it, you're giving it more discursive and media life, which is, I think, an important thing to do, both to figure out what is happening, what it means, and where people might go from there. At the same time, of course, there is a radical difference between being in Twitter solidarity, which I'm not demeaning at all, being in Twitter solidarity and being on the street or being exposed to violence, detention, any number of possible quite important physical and political consequences. So there's a differential of risk and exposure that separates those who are on site from those who are reporting, commenting, elaborating. But there's an indissoluble link between them, even though it's not an identity. They're not identical situations. So that's my way of trying to address that. About non-harmony, I think in general that dependency is hell and that interdependency is hell. I'm sorry, I think my jokes aren't coming across. I think living in a world with others in which we actually recognize fundamental interdependency is not always an experience of love, happiness, or harmony. We rail against dependency, we can't bear it, but we also can't deny it. And I think those complex set of emotions, they certainly come to the fore in social institutions where interdependency is very heightened, but also when you belong to a political movement together and people speak it or articulate it or start making sense of it in ways that are conflicting. Now, I think it's inevitable for a movement that, for some people, it may be the authoritarian structure of the regime that is most appalling. For others, it may be privatization. For others, it might be making gay, lesbian, transgender lives visible in public space. As part of these struggles, there may be very different ways of articulating what is being done for what purpose and why. I don't necessarily think people have to have one purpose. I think there are interlinking purposes, and there are certain kinds of practices and discussions that can keep those conflicts alive in ways that are actually mobilizing and important, and not necessarily paralyzing. But I do think that harmony is an impossible ideal, and that it tends to produce more fragmentation than it solves. It's nothing worse than being in a large group where everybody's in harmony with one another and you're definitely not in harmony with them, or you're part of another group that's definitely not in harmony with them. And then the question is whether a robust democratic movement can maintain and work with that disharmony as part of its democratic character. So I suppose I follow Laclau and Mouffe to some degree, and their important way of figuring antagonism at the center of democratic forms of solidarity, which isn't to say that I affirm conflict for conflict's sake or that I love being in fights with people. I do not. But that I accept that there are many different kinds of sources of disagreement, and that a robust movement is able to move with disagreement rather than enforce impossible or premature resolution. Certainly, I mean, there are many different ways that people come together and fall apart. And I don't mean to be suggesting that there is one way or that way is changeless. I'm not exactly sure what the Hartnegri reference is to, but I do think that Michael Hart's recent work on love suggests that he and I would have very different views on what political sociality looks like and what democratic gatherings look like and what they're about. I do worry that position sometimes does subscribe to a kind of vitalism in its romanticization of the Dionysian, for instance, and some of my more critical views on the surging multitude, contrasting the idea of aliveness with struggling for conditions of livability is perhaps a small polemic against them, although, you know, I'm on the same side as those people for the most part. The question you're asking, whether the question of who the people are, whether that's really important to contemporary movements, that's a really, really crucial question. And I suppose one answer to that is that I don't think that the question who constitutes the people, I don't think it has to be asked explicitly in that way, but when a group of people do come together to claim or reclaim public space or to protect it against its destruction or decimation, they are doing it in some ways that indexes the idea of the people or the populace or the public. That is part of what is happening. That's part of the entitlement. That's part of the exercise. It's part of the claim, whether it's spoken in that language or enacted in another one. So, in my view, I think the question of the people and the question of popular sovereignty or self-determination is bound up with the question of to whom does public space belong. To whom does public space belong? It belongs to the people if it is public space. Otherwise, it's no longer public space. So I want to say it's presupposed by the struggle itself. think there's some other.
Okay.
Thank you very much for coming. My question is actually, what would you say for activists and students of theory when, this is true in every country, but to differing percentages, how do activists operate in a country where a percentage of the population is actually supporting the government's efforts to curb their civil rights? So you mentioned that we the people doesn't actually speak for all the people, so if there's a percentage of the society that actually supports the state's efforts to curtail their rights, how can activists overcome this, either on a theoretical perspective or a practical point? Thank you.
Well, it's a great question, but I can't give you practical advice. I mean, I'm just not very good at that.
Should we take another one?
Yeah, we could. Well, let me just
Okay,
briefly address this one, if that's okay. What I want to just say is that when it becomes in the interest of a large number of people to understand themselves as consumers, entrepreneurs, members of aspiring members of an economic system where profit or security is being held out as a possible benefit, there has to be a kind of pretty strong criticism and opposition to that entire scheme of values. In other words, other kinds of values have to be brought into the fore, and that's a solicitation. You know, that's about persuasion. It's about struggle. It's about solicitation. So the question again is not who are the people, and we may be very unhappy to learn who the people are, right? But how does the hegemonic contest over who the people can be, how is that to be waged, right? And that strikes me as the political work of anybody who's seeking to safeguard some sense of democracy and the public good over and against, say, privatization and creeping authoritarianism. That has to be part of a very large mobilization. But I think we have to think about the people as a term over which there is there's a hegemonic struggle.
The two others over there. İşte orada vardı orada. Şöyle atlayıp gitsek. Okay.
Hi. My question is kind of general, but I'm wondering if you can speak more about what you ended your thoughts on, which was sort of the demand for new forms or new ways of solidarity. I'm really interested in that because I think in many ways what we're seeing here in Istanbul, I'm feeling like there's a need for that, and I'm not sure what it looks like. I'm wondering if you could say more about that.
Well, I think the only thing that I want to say right now, well, I guess there are 2 points. One is sometimes an assembly is ephemeral and transitory because it articulates what it has to articulate, and its own divisions or its own material conditions of perpetuating are not sufficient to sustain it. Other times, an assembly can be very transitory precisely because it's destroyed by police force and compulsory expulsion from the site of its occupation, which we've seen here and we've seen clearly in the Occupy movement in the US and in other places as well. So then the real question is, how does the relationship to police power have to be cultivated in order to expand the life of a solidarity movement or a democratic movement such that it's not condemned to be merely ephemeral for because of police violence. And I think that kind of practice of resisting police or operating with police is extremely important. And that involves an elaborate network. It also involves a network of people who are not necessarily activists in an immediate sense, like lawyers and media people who are willing to take whatever risks there are for them. I also think that the conditions of increasing precarity, or precaritization, mean that certain kinds of features of political life have to be foregrounded and are being foregrounded, so that we gather not just to say, I want to be able to speak my mind. Don't worry, I'm well fed, I have a job, everything else is perfectly secure in my world. I just want to be able to speak freely. It's not a pure anti-censorship campaign. I want to be able to speak. I want to be able to move because I am this body, and this body has to be fed and supported and requires health care and requires shelter and has rights to work. And all of those, what we would call kind of concrete rights or embodied rights, I think are coming to the fore under conditions of precaritization. And the way that movements work to set up temporary shelters or to foreground issues of embodied interdependency seem to characterize that as if something about economic interdependency and economic rights is being asserted in the very form of the assembly itself, and that's why I think it's not just the abstract rights of individuals that is at issue, but the capacity to survive precarity and to flourish in a world under conditions that are not vanquished by securitarian control or neoliberal forms of decimation. And I think in relationship to those particular issues right now, there are different kinds of assemblies and different kinds of actions that are required. Should we take maybe one or two more questions and then adjourn? I think we can gather both of them.
Yeah. Okay. So there's someone over there around the shade. God, maybe.
I'm sorry, but I have to speak Turkish. Judith Butler'ın burada olmasından dolayı, onu dinlemekten dolayı sevinçliyim ama kendisine sorabileceğim bir soru yok. Çünkü İngilizcem onu anlamama yetmedi. Dolayısıyla size soruyorum, niye bir çevirmen yok?
So I have I don't know why there is not one, but I completely agree with you that there should be one, and I'm sorry. Next time.
I want to say it very short.
I would say it in Turkish.
Yeah, I'll say it in Turkish though. Tercüman yoktu çünkü bu konuşma olmayacaktı bile. Yani çok son dakikada yapabildik. Dolayısıyla yani bir takım sorunlar yüzünden bir ay önce iptal edilen bir konuşmayı yapıyoruz. Çok son dakikada olduğu için tercüman ayarlanamadı, özür dileriz. Pardon, şey dedi ama o kadarını anladınız sanıyorum değil mi? Neyse. Peki. Haklısınız diyor. Haklısınız, bir daha sefere umarım böyle bir eksiklik yok.
Okay, I just want to add that we were not sure, and I'm sure this is what she said, but I'm just going to add it in my own.
Right.
We were not sure I was going to be able to give this talk until about 5 or 6 days ago or 10 days ago. So this was put together very quickly. But if we had more time to plan, I agree. We have translation next time.
See, she understands Turkish. Okay, maybe 2 more questions.
Yeah.
2 or 3.
Yeah. Okay.
Üçünüzü bir arada alabilirsek 3 son soru olarak. Olur mu?
Collect them all.
You sort of started addressing this question in one of your answers, specifically to the question of harmony and how different groups will work together. But I think this is going to get into something more specific. The 2 groups that were very prominent here in the Gezi resistance were the LGBT groups and the anti-capitalist Muslims. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are regarding why it would be those groups that would have become prominent in the resistance. One thing that I can think of myself is in relation to how these bodies are produced differently, both differently from the hegemonic norm, but also differently from each other. I mean, in this question, I'm not really opposing these 2 groups at all necessarily, so that's not where the question is coming from. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on these.
It interests me quite a bit, but as you know, it would be a really rather stupid thing for an American academic to come and tell you why these 2 groups. I could tell you who to invite. They will tell you. I can give you a list of people who would answer that question. I'm here to learn about this right now, so, ask me in a little while.
See you next time.
That's lame, isn't it? I was lame.
My name is Margilis Kipiotis. I teach at this university. And I would like to return to the issue of terminology. We kept focusing on the term the people. And what has happened, not only during the last Gezi event, but also earlier years in this country and elsewhere, is that also other terms have been employed. In this particular case, it was interesting that there were terms used by the authorities or by the Prime Minister himself to describe those who define themselves as the people. And then those people endorsed these terms. And so they became the Trumpers or whatever. They didn't have any problem about that. So they didn't call themselves the people, but they used the names that others called them in order to accuse them. That's number 1. Number 2, what happens if the authorities claim that they represent not the people, but the citizens, or the nation, as opposed to the people. So we see that we have a repertoire of terms to refer to collectivity. And I guess that the people here is not enough as a point of reference.
I think that there is this question of when and when, I don't know, I don't want to fetishize the idea of the people, it's overused, it's cliche, it doesn't have to be that word that does what I'm trying to describe. Okay, so I'm not saying it must be that word, okay, or I stand for that word, or you should stand for that word. I don't know, it's discursive moment and it's contested, so it can work in many different ways. But what I am hearing in your question is precisely this issue of when and where, let's say, a people, a populace, gets instrumentalized or owned by the state, so that state sovereignty uses popular sovereignty as its instrument, or it understands its own power to contain and own popular sovereignty, to represent it, right? And citizen can work sometimes precisely to assimilate the people into the state. You are a member of the state, you are a participant in the state. And it also divides citizen and non-citizen, right? At which point the people are divided along those. So there can be an act of kind of appropriation, instrumentalization, and ownership in that language. At which point, my question is, I don't know if there are words that can separate popular sovereignty from state sovereignty. Maybe the people, maybe not the people. Maybe no words. Maybe a gathering without words. Maybe a visual sequence. Maybe another kind of enactment altogether. I can't predict that. But I think your question attests to the necessity of that particular separation and the risk that is involved precisely there. Okay, I think we're, okay, one last, but then this is truly the last.
Yes, I know.
Okay.
Truly the last, because she was so
Okay, please.
Thanks, Gordon. Well, my question is more about the power of assembly. You did talk a lot about the theory and the concepts of it, but I'm wondering how to actually translate the power of assembly into real change, and more necessarily the change that actually represents the will of the people who actually started the assembly at the first place. Because I mean, it could lead to a change after Tahrir, but it is a discussion if it was actually representative of what the people wanted. So what do you think on this? Could you elaborate more on the power of assembly?
So when you use the term power in that particular question, it seems to me that you're talking about the power to effect change, right? So effective power. The conditions of effecting change are shifting and strategic and difficult. So, for instance, right now we might think is there a lull in this movement? Is this movement now taking new forms? What are its goals? How is it reformulating those goals? All those things have to be tracked in ways that are very specific and very contextual. Because I'm not, some of my colleagues are good Leninists. I'm not a very good Leninist. I can't say, this is how it works, this is what you must do, I don't do that. But I am interested in when it does work, or when it works provisionally, or when it starts to work and becomes actually a mass movement, or does affect more radical change. And I think at this point in time, we have to be aware of the different ways that mobilizations work, the different forms that political struggles take. I don't think there's one form. And perhaps the question we have to ask are, what are the conditions of renewability under conditions where police power is accelerating and where state power is augmenting itself? And those are very specific kinds of strategic questions. The power of the people, or popular, the power of assembly is not some ontological resource we have that just surges up and creates change. It is exercised through deliberation, enactment, forms of solidarity, forms of division, new ways of strategizing, different kinds of alliances that are made or broken. These are, your questions are questions that belong to the study and practice of social movements more broadly. And I don't think they can be answered at a purely theoretical level.
Okay, so thank you very much, Judith.
Thank you.
Thank you.